The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Miller's bakery, casting golden streaks across the worn wooden floors. Sarah pressed her small nose against the cool glass display case, her breath fogging the surface as she stared at the rows of perfect pastries inside. The chocolate croissants gleamed under the warm lights, their flaky layers promising sweetness she could almost taste. "Mama, can we get one today?" Sarah whispered, tugging gently on her mother's coat sleeve. At 7 years old, she had learned to ask quietly, to hope without expecting too much. Li Wei looked down at her daughter's hopeful face and felt her heart crack a little more. The $23 in her wallet had to last until Friday, and it was only Tuesday morning. She had already counted it 3 times while Sarah slept, spreading the crumpled bills on their small kitchen table under the flickering light. Rent was due in 2 weeks. The electric bill sat unopened on the counter, its red lettering visible through the envelope. "Not today, sweet pea," Li Wei said softly, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 small disappointments. "But maybe soon." Sarah nodded, understanding more than any child should. She had heard this promise many times before and had learned not to ask when soon might come. Instead, she pressed closer to the glass, memorizing every detail of the pastries. The way the chocolate drizzle curved over the almond Danish, how the cinnamon roll's spiral seemed to go on forever, the delicate sugar crystals that sparkled on top of the fruit tarts like tiny diamonds. Bakery owner Mrs. Miller watched this daily ritual from behind her counter. She was a large woman with kind eyes and flour permanently embedded under her fingernails. For 3 weeks now, she had seen the same mother and daughter come in every morning at exactly 8:15. They never bought anything. The little girl would study each pastry with the intensity of a scholar, while her mother stood quietly behind her, counting change in her pocket that Mrs. Miller suspected was never quite enough. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Mrs. Miller called out, wiping her hands on her apron. Li Wei startled slightly, not used to being addressed by the shop owners in this neighborhood. Most looked right through her, seeing only another struggling single mother in second-hand clothes. "Yes, very beautiful," Li Wei replied carefully, her accent making the words sound musical despite her nervousness. She had come to America 5 years ago, carrying nothing but dreams and a baby daughter. The dreams had proven heavier to carry than she expected. Sarah continued her examination of the pastries, unaware of the adult conversation happening above her head. She had favored a small apple turnover with a golden crust that seemed to glow in the morning light. She had been watching it for days, and somehow it was always there, as if waiting for her. Other pastries came and went, bought by customers who walked in with confidence and left with white boxes tied with string. But the apple turnover remained, and Sarah had begun to think of it as hers, even though she knew it wasn't. Li Wei worked 2 jobs to keep their small apartment. During the day, she cleaned office buildings downtown, invisible to the people who worked there. Her supervisor, Mr., was understanding about her need to drop Sarah at school first, but the pay barely covered their basic needs. At night, after Sarah fell asleep, Li Wei would sit at her kitchen table with her laptop, doing data entry work for a company she had never seen. The computer was second-hand, slow, and temperamental, but it was their lifeline to a few extra dollars each month. The morning routine at Miller's bakery had become precious to both mother and daughter. It was their moment of luxury, their window into a world where beautiful things existed just to be admired. Li Wei told herself it was harmless. They weren't hurting anyone by looking. But deep down, she worried about what lessons she was teaching Sarah about wanting things they couldn't have. "The apple turnovers are especially good today," Mrs. Miller said, her voice casual but her eyes kind. "I made them with fresh apples from the orchard outside town." Sarah's eyes widened. Someone had noticed her favorite pastry. She looked up at Mrs. Miller with wonder, as if the woman had just revealed that she could read minds. "They look perfect," Sarah said, her voice filled with genuine appreciation. "Like little golden presents." Mrs. Miller's heart melted at the child's pure joy in simply observing beauty. She had been running this bakery for 30 years and had served thousands of customers. But something about this little girl's daily pilgrimage touched her deeply. The way Sarah studied each pastry with such careful attention, as if she was trying to memorize their essence. Li Wei checked her watch, a habit born from years of living by strict schedules. Sarah needed to be at school in 20 minutes, and Li Wei had to catch the bus to her first job. The cleaning company didn't tolerate lateness, and she couldn't afford to lose this position. "Time to go, Sarah," she said gently, placing her hand on her daughter's shoulder. Sarah took one last long look at the apple turnover, whispering something under her breath that sounded like a goodbye. She did this every morning, and it never failed to break Li Wei's heart a little more. They walked to school together, Sarah chattering about her upcoming spelling test while Li Wei mentally reviewed her budget for the 100th time. The math never changed, no matter how many different ways she calculated it. There was simply not enough to cover everything, and certainly not enough for pastry shop visits. Washington Elementary School buzzed with the energy of children arriving for another day of learning. Li Wei watched other parents dropping off their kids, some hurried, others leisurely, many clutching coffee cups from the expensive shop down the street. She wondered if they realized how lucky they were to buy small luxuries without calculation, without consequence. "Have a wonderful day, sweet pea," Li Wei said, kissing Sarah's forehead. "Learn something amazing." Sarah hugged her mother tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of the lavender soap Li Wei bought at the dollar store. "I love you, Mama. Maybe today will be the day for the apple turnover." Li Wei's throat tightened. Sarah's optimism was unshakable, despite all evidence that today would be much like yesterday. "Maybe it will be," she said, though they both knew it wouldn't. After dropping Sarah at school, Li Wei rode the bus to the financial district, where she would spend the next 8 hours making other people's workspaces pristine. She cleaned conference rooms where million-dollar deals were discussed, emptied trash cans filled with the remnants of expensive lunches, and polished windows that offered views of the city she could barely afford to live in. During her lunch break, Li Wei sat in the building's lobby and did math on the back of a receipt. Rent $800, utilities $150, groceries $200 if she was careful. Sarah's school supplies and clothes, whatever was left, which was never enough. The apple turnover cost $3.50. She had seen the price tag during one of their morning visits. $3.50 might as well have been $300. Meanwhile, Sarah sat in her second-grade classroom trying to focus on Mrs. lesson about addition and subtraction. But her mind kept drifting to the bakery, to the warm smell of fresh bread, and the way the morning light made everything golden. During art class, she drew picture after picture of pastries, each one more detailed than the last. Her teacher, Mrs., noticed the recurring theme but didn't comment. She had taught long enough to recognize the art of a child who was dreaming of something just out of reach. At lunch, Sarah ate her peanut butter sandwich with careful appreciation. Li Wei always cut it into triangles and included a small bag of crackers. Sometimes there was an apple cut into slices with the brown parts trimmed away. Sarah never complained about the simplicity of her lunch, but she noticed that some of her classmates had elaborate meals with multiple courses and special treats. "My mom says we might go to Miller's Bakery after school today," announced Jessica, the girl who sat next to Sarah. "She promised me a cupcake if I do well on my spelling test." Sarah smiled and nodded, though something twisted in her stomach. She was happy for Jessica, but it reminded her of all the promises that lived in the word maybe. A word her mother used often, but that rarely led to action. The afternoon passed slowly for Li Wei. She cleaned 16 offices, 3 conference rooms, and 2 executive bathrooms. Her back ached from bending over desks, and her hands were dry from the cleaning chemicals. But she worked with careful attention to detail, knowing that her job depended on the satisfaction of people who would never know her name. At 3:30, Li Wei finished her shift and hurried to catch the bus back to Sarah's school. The afternoon pickup routine was sacred time 15 minutes when she could focus entirely on her daughter's day, on the small triumphs and disappointments that made up a 7-year-old's world. Sarah emerged from the school building with her backpack bouncing and her hair slightly messed from playground activities. Her face lit up when she saw her mother waiting by the fence, just as it did every day. This moment never lost its magic for Li Wei, the pure joy on her daughter's face when they were reunited. "How was your day, sweet pea?" Li Wei asked, taking Sarah's backpack and slinging it over her own shoulder. "Good, I got all my spelling words right on the practice test, and shared his crackers with me at lunch because I helped him with his math." Sarah skipped beside her mother as they walked. "Can we go see the pastries on the way home?" Li Wei hesitated. Their usual route home didn't pass Miller's Bakery. She had been taking a deliberate detour each morning to give Sarah this small pleasure. But the afternoon visit would mean another detour, more time spent looking at things they couldn't afford. "Please, Mama, just for a minute." The hope in Sarah's voice was impossible to resist. Li Wei nodded, and they changed direction toward the bakery. As they walked, Sarah chattered about her day, but Li Wei found herself lost in thought. What was she doing, really? Was this daily pilgrimage helping Sarah appreciate beauty, or was it teaching her to want things that would always be out of reach? Miller's bakery looked different in the afternoon light. The morning rush was over, and Mrs. Miller was restocking the display cases with fresh items for the next day. She looked up when she heard the bell above the door chime and smiled when she saw her regular visitors. "Back again," Mrs. Miller said warmly. "You two are my most dedicated admirers." Sarah rushed to the display case, eager to see what new treasures had appeared since morning. The apple turnover was still there, still golden, still perfect. But now there were new items, 2 cream puffs dusted with powdered sugar, small fruit tarts that looked like tiny works of art, and cookies shaped like flowers. Li Wei watched her daughter's face transform with wonder and felt a familiar mix of love and guilt. Sarah's capacity for joy in simple beauty was remarkable, but Li Wei couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow failing her daughter by not being able to provide more than just looking. Mrs. Miller said quietly, approaching Li Wei while Sarah was absorbed in her pastry examination. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Li Wei felt a flutter of panic. Were they not welcome here? Had their daily visits without purchases become a nuisance? She followed Mrs. Miller to the side of the store, her heart racing. "I hope we're not bothering you," Li Wei said quickly. "Sarah just loves to look at the beautiful things you make. We don't mean any trouble." Mrs. Miller's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her apron, a nervous habit she had developed over decades of difficult conversations. She had been running Miller's bakery since her husband passed away 15 years ago, and in that time, she had learned to read people the way others read books. Li Wei carried herself with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to make every dollar stretch, every choice matter. "I've been watching you and Sarah come in each morning," Mrs. Miller continued, her voice gentle but purposeful. "That little girl has something special, the way she looks at my pastries like they're precious jewels. Most people rush in, grab what they need, and leave, but Sarah, she really sees them." Li Wei's stomach clenched with embarrassment. "I'm sorry if we're taking up space. We can stop coming if it's a problem for your business." No, Mrs. Miller said quickly, waving her flour-dusted hands. "You misunderstand me completely. I was wondering, would Sarah be interested in helping me sometimes? After school, maybe? I could use an extra pair of young eyes to help me arrange the display cases, make sure everything looks perfect." Li Wei stared at the older woman, confusion written across her face. "I don't understand. You want to hire Sarah?" Mrs. Miller chuckled, a warm sound that filled the space between them. "Not hire exactly, more like an apprenticeship. Sarah has an artist's eye. The way she studies my work, I can tell she understands the craft. I could teach her about baking, about making beautiful things. And in return—" She paused, glancing toward Sarah, who was still lost in wonder at the display case. "Well, everyone deserves to taste the things they help create." The offer hung in the air between them like something fragile and precious. Li Wei felt tears prick at her eyes, but she couldn't tell if they were from gratitude or the fear that this was too good to be true. In her experience, kindness from strangers usually came with hidden costs. "Why would you do this?" Li Wei asked quietly. "You don't even know us." Mrs. Miller was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant with memory. "I had a daughter once," she said finally. "Emma, she would have been about Sarah's age now if—" She trailed off, then shook her head. "Some things happen for reasons we can't understand, but sometimes we get chances to do good in small ways. This feels like one of those chances." Li Wei looked across the bakery at Sarah, who had moved on from the display case and was now examining the way the afternoon light caught the glass containers filled with colorful sprinkles. Her daughter's curiosity was boundless, her joy infectious even in the simple act of observation. "What would she actually do?" Li Wei asked, practical concerns overriding her emotional response. "She's only 7, and I work until 6 most days. I couldn't pay you for watching her." "She could come after school, stay until you finish work. I'll teach her to arrange pastries, to understand how different textures and colors work together. Maybe some simple baking tasks, measuring flour, stirring batter. Nothing dangerous," Mrs. Miller assured her. "And Li Wei, this isn't about payment. This is about giving a child who appreciates beauty the chance to create it." Sarah had discovered a new display wedding cakes photos mounted on the wall, showing elaborate creations Mrs. Miller had crafted for special occasions. She stood transfixed by a 3-tiered cake decorated with sugar flowers that looked so real they seemed to tremble in an invisible breeze. "Mama, look," Sarah called softly. "It's like a garden made of cake." Mrs. Miller and Li Wei both turned to watch Sarah's reaction to the photographs. The child's face glowed with pure aesthetic pleasure, the same expression she wore during their morning visits to the display cases. "See," Mrs. Miller whispered, "she has it, that thing that makes someone an artist instead of just someone who follows recipes." Li Wei felt the familiar weight of making a decision that could change everything. She had learned to be cautious, to examine every opportunity for hidden traps. But looking at Sarah's face, seeing the genuine kindness in Mrs. Miller's eyes, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility that good things could happen without strings attached. "Could we try it for a week?" Li Wei asked carefully. "See how it works for everyone." Mrs. Miller's face broke into a wide smile. "Of course, we'll start small, see how Sarah likes it, no pressure on anyone." They rejoined Sarah at the wedding cake display, and Mrs. Miller knelt down to the little girl's eye level. "Sarah, how would you like to learn how to make beautiful things like these?" Sarah's eyes went wide with disbelief. "Really? You would teach me?" "I would love to teach you. We could start tomorrow after school if your mama says it's okay." Sarah turned to Li Wei with such hope and excitement that Li Wei felt her last reservations crumble. "Can I, Mama? Please." "We can try it," Li Wei said, and was rewarded with Sarah throwing her arms around her waist in a fierce hug. As they walked home that evening, Sarah practically vibrated with anticipation. She peppered Li Wei with questions about what she might learn, what she might make, whether she would get to wear an apron like Mrs. Miller's. Li Wei answered as best she could, but her mind was elsewhere, processing this unexpected turn their routine had taken. Their apartment building came into view, a tired-looking complex with peeling paint and a broken intercom system. But tonight, it looked different to Li Wei. Tonight, it looked like home to a child who was about to learn how to create beautiful things. Inside their small apartment, Sarah immediately began drawing pictures of everything she remembered from the bakery. She sketched the display cases, the wedding cakes, and Mrs. Miller herself, adding her own imaginative flourishes to each image. Li Wei made dinner rice with vegetables and a small piece of chicken they would share, and watched her daughter work with intense concentration. "Tell me what you're drawing, sweet pea," Li Wei said as she stirred their meal. "This is Mrs. Miller, but I'm giving her magic hands because she makes magic food," Sarah explained, adding sparkles around the figure's fingers. "And this is me learning to make the apple turnover. Do you think she'll teach me that one?" Li Wei's throat tightened with emotion. "I think Mrs. Miller will teach you whatever you're ready to learn." After dinner, as Li Wei helped Sarah with homework, her mind wandered to practical concerns. What if this arrangement didn't work out? What if Mrs. Miller changed her mind? What if Sarah got her hopes up only to have them crushed? Li Wei had spent years protecting her daughter from disappointment, and this felt like stepping into uncertain territory. But there was something else too, a tiny flutter of hope that Li Wei had almost forgotten how to recognize. Maybe, just maybe, good things could happen to people like them. The next morning, their visit to Miller's bakery felt different. Instead of the familiar routine of looking and leaving, they were met by Mrs. Miller's knowing smile and a small white apron hanging on a hook behind the counter Sarah's size. "Ready for your first lesson?" Mrs. Miller asked Sarah, who nodded so enthusiastically her whole body seemed to bounce. Li Wei kissed Sarah goodbye and headed to work with an unfamiliar lightness in her step. For the first time in months, she found herself looking forward to the end of the workday, eager to hear about Sarah's adventures in the bakery. At school, Sarah could barely concentrate on her lessons. Her mind kept drifting to flour and sugar, to the way Mrs. Miller's hands moved with such confidence and grace. During lunch, she drew more pictures of pastries, this time adding notes about what ingredients she thought might go into each one. When the final bell rang, Sarah practically flew out of the building. Li Wei was there waiting, as always, but today they had somewhere special to go. "Are you ready for your first day at bakery school?" Li Wei asked, taking Sarah's hand as they walked toward Miller's bakery. "I've been ready my whole life," Sarah said with the seriousness only a 7-year-old could bring to such a declaration. Mrs. Miller was waiting for them with a small apron and a plan. She had thought carefully about age-appropriate tasks that would teach Sarah about baking while keeping her safe and engaged. They would start with observation and organization, then moved to simple measuring and mixing tasks. "First rule of baking," Mrs. Miller said, tying the apron around Sarah's waist. "Clean hands make beautiful food." Sarah solemnly washed her hands at the small sink behind the counter, treating this first instruction like a sacred ritual. Li Wei watched for a few minutes, seeing her daughter transform from curious observer to eager student. "I'll be back at 6, Li Wei told Mrs. Miller. "Are you sure this isn't too much trouble?" "Go on," Mrs. Miller said with a shooing motion. "We have work to do." Li Wei left the bakery with mixed emotions. Relief that Sarah was safe and happy, gratitude for Mrs. Miller's unexpected kindness, and underneath it all, a nagging worry that this was all too good to last. The afternoon passed differently for both mother and daughter. Li Wei found herself working with unusual energy, eager to finish her tasks and return to see how Sarah's first lesson had gone. She caught herself smiling while she dusted conference room tables, imagining her daughter learning to create the beautiful pastries they had admired for so long. Meanwhile, Sarah was discovering that baking was both simpler and more complex than she had imagined. Mrs. Miller started by showing her how to arrange day-old pastries in the discounted section, teaching her about color balance and visual appeal. "See how the chocolate croissant looks next to the fruit Danish?" Mrs. Miller asked, moving items around in the display case. "The dark and light colors help each other look more beautiful." Sarah nodded seriously, studying the arrangement with the same intensity she had always brought to observing the pastries. But now, she was learning the principles behind the beauty, understanding that the lovely displays didn't happen by accident. Next, Mrs. Miller showed Sarah how to measure flour using the proper scooping and leveling technique. Sarah's small hands were perfect for the delicate work, and she approached each measurement with mathematical precision that impressed her teacher. "You're a natural," Mrs. Miller said as Sarah successfully measured out ingredients for a simple cookie dough. "Some people rush through this part, but you understand that baking is really about precision." As the afternoon wore on, Sarah learned to crack eggs, only breaking 2 shell pieces into the bowl, to use the electric mixer on low speed, and to roll out cookie dough to an even thickness. Each new skill felt like a small miracle to her, a door opening to a world where she could create instead of just observe. When Li Wei returned at 6 o'clock, she found Sarah carefully placing finished cookies on a cooling rack, her face smudged with flour and glowing with pride. "Mama, look what I made," Sarah called out, gesturing to the tray of golden cookies shaped like flowers and hearts. Li Wei felt tears spring to her eyes. It wasn't just the cookies, though they were beautiful. It was the confidence in Sarah's voice, the way she stood a little taller, the pride of creation rather than just appreciation. "They're perfect," Li Wei said, meaning it completely. Mrs. Miller appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. "She's remarkable, Li Wei, patient, careful, eager to learn, and she has questions about everything, why this temperature instead of that one, how different flours change the texture. She thinks like a baker." Sarah carefully packed 6 cookies into a small white box, her payment for the afternoon's work, though Mrs. Miller had insisted it wasn't payment, but rather a baker's privilege to taste her own creations. As they walked home, Sarah carried the box of cookies like a precious treasure, telling Li Wei everything she had learned about measuring and mixing and the science of baking temperatures. Li Wei listened to her daughter's excitement and felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of worry she had carried for so long. 3 weeks into Sarah's apprenticeship at Miller's bakery, the morning routine had transformed completely. Instead of pressing her nose against the display case with longing, Sarah now unlocked the bakery door each morning with her own small key, arriving early to help Mrs. Miller prepare for the day's customers. Li Wei watched her daughter move through the bakery with growing confidence, arranging pastries with an artist's eye and greeting regular customers by name. But this particular Tuesday morning felt different. Li Wei had received a call the night before that changed everything. Her second job, the data entry work she did from home, was ending. The company was moving operations overseas, and her small but crucial additional income would disappear at the end of the week. She had spent the sleepless nights staring at numbers that no longer added up, wondering how to tell Sarah that their newfound stability was about to crumble. "Mama, are you okay?" Sarah asked as they walked toward the bakery. "You seem sad today." Li Wei forced a smile, not wanting to burden her 7-year-old daughter with adult worries. "Just tired, sweet pea," Tell me what you're going to make with Mrs. Miller today." Sarah's face brightened immediately. She said, "I'm ready to learn the apple turnover recipe, the real one with fresh apples and cinnamon and everything." Her eyes sparkled with anticipation. "She says I've learned enough basic skills that I can handle a complete recipe from start to finish." Li Wei's heart clenched. The apple turnover, Sarah's favorite pastry, the one she had stared at through the glass for so many weeks. Now her daughter would learn to create the very thing that had once seemed impossibly out of reach. The irony wasn't lost on Li Wei that just as Sarah was achieving this small dream, their ability to continue the arrangement was slipping away. At Miller's bakery, Mrs. Miller noticed immediately that something was troubling Li Wei. After 30 years of working with people, she had developed an intuitive sense for when someone was carrying heavy burdens. Li Wei's usual quiet gratitude was shadowed with worry, and her goodbye hug with Sarah lasted a few seconds longer than normal. "Everything all right?" Mrs. Miller asked gently as Sarah hung up her jacket and washed her hands with the careful precision she had learned. "Yes, everything's fine," Li Wei replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "I'll see you both at 6. As Li Wei left for work, Mrs. Miller made a mental note to watch for signs of whatever was troubling Sarah's mother. In the meantime, she had promised Sarah an important lesson, and she intended to deliver. "Today is special," Mrs. Miller announced as Sarah tied on her apron. "Today you learn to make apple turnovers from the very beginning. We'll choose the apples together, make the filling, work with the pastry dough, and create something beautiful." Sarah's excitement was infectious. She followed Mrs. Miller to the small storage room where boxes of fresh apples waited, each variety carefully labeled. Mrs. Miller let Sarah examine different types, teaching her how to identify the best apples for baking by their firmness, color, and aroma. "For turnovers, we want apples that hold their shape when cooked but still become tender," Mrs. Miller explained as Sarah carefully selected fruit. "Too soft and they become mushy, too hard and they stay crunchy. It's all about finding the right balance." Sarah chose each apple with the same careful attention she brought to everything in the bakery. She had learned that every ingredient mattered, that baking was as much about patience and precision as it was about creativity. In the kitchen, Mrs. Miller demonstrated how to peel apples in one long ribbon, the knife moving in smooth, confident strokes. Sarah tried to copy the technique, producing shorter pieces but showing steady improvement with each apple. "Mrs. Miller," Sarah said as she worked, "why do you think some people are good at making beautiful things and others aren't?" Mrs. Miller paused in her peeling, considering the question seriously. "I think everyone has the ability to create beauty, Sarah, but some people are afraid to try, or they don't believe they deserve to make something wonderful. The secret is practice and believing that your hands can create good things." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, processing this wisdom as she continued peeling. "My mama works so hard, but she doesn't make anything beautiful at her job. She just cleans up after other people. Do you think she could learn to bake too?" The innocence of the question hit Mrs. Miller unexpectedly. She had been so focused on nurturing Sarah's talent that she hadn't fully considered how Li Wei might be feeling, watching her daughter flourish in ways that seemed closed off to her own life. "I think your mama is already creating something beautiful," Mrs. Miller said carefully. "She's creating a good life for you, making sure you're safe and loved and have opportunities to learn. That's the most important kind of creation there is." They worked together in comfortable silence for a while, dicing the peeled apples and mixing them with cinnamon, sugar, and a touch of lemon juice. Sarah measured each ingredient with the precision Mrs. Miller had taught her, checking and double-checking before adding anything to the bowl. Meanwhile, Li Wei was having the worst workday she could remember. Her supervisor at the cleaning company had announced that they were cutting hours due to budget constraints. Li Wei's shift would be reduced from 8 hours to 6, starting next week. Combined with the loss of her evening data entry job, the financial impact would be devastating. During her lunch break, Li Wei sat in the building lobby and tried to calculate a new budget on the back of an envelope. No matter how many different ways she approached the numbers, they painted the same impossible picture. She would have to find another job immediately, which likely meant working evenings again, which meant Sarah couldn't continue her apprenticeship at the bakery. The thought of taking this opportunity away from her daughter made Li Wei feel physically sick. In just 3 weeks, Sarah had blossomed in ways Li Wei hadn't thought possible. Her confidence had grown, her curiosity had found a focused outlet, and she talked about baking with the passion other children reserved for cartoons or toys. How could Li Wei explain that dreams, no matter how small, were still luxuries they couldn't afford? Back at the bakery, Sarah was learning to work with pastry dough, rolling it to an even thickness, cutting perfect squares, and placing small mounds of spiced apples in the center of each piece. Mrs. Miller guided her through folding the dough over the filling and crimping the edges with a fork to create the characteristic turnover shape. The secret to a perfect turnover is in the seal, Mrs. Miller explained, demonstrating the technique. You want to make sure no filling can leak out during baking, but you don't want to overwork the dough or it becomes tough. Sarah followed the instructions with intense concentration, creating turnovers that were perhaps not perfect, but showed clear understanding of the technique. Each pastry she completed filled her with a sense of accomplishment that was entirely new to her young life. As the turnovers baked in the oven, filling the bakery with the scent of cinnamon and apples, Sarah helped Mrs. Miller prepare other items for the afternoon customers. But her attention kept drifting to the oven window, where she could see her creations slowly turning golden brown. "Mrs. Miller," Sarah said as she arranged cookies in the display case, "do you think I could ever own a bakery like this someday?" Mrs. Miller smiled at the question. "I think you could do anything you set your mind to, Sarah. You have the patience to learn, the creativity to imagine new things, and the kindness to make people happy with what you create. Those are the most important ingredients for any kind of success." When the timer chimed, Sarah watched with breathless anticipation as Mrs. Miller removed the tray of golden turnovers from the oven. They looked exactly like the ones Sarah had admired for so many weeks through the display case glass, crispy, golden, and perfect. "You made those," Mrs. Miller said with pride. "From choosing the apples to taking them out of the oven, every step was yours." Sarah stared at the turnovers with wonder. It seemed impossible that her own hands had created something so beautiful, so professional-looking. She had gone from dreamer to creator, from observer to artist. The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers, and Sarah helped serve them with growing confidence. Several regulars commented on how much she had learned, and Sarah glowed under their praise. But her proudest moment came when Mrs. Miller placed 2 of Sarah's apple turnovers in the main display case alongside the other pastries. "These deserve to be seen," Mrs. Miller declared. "Beautiful work belongs where everyone can appreciate it." At 6 o'clock, Li Wei arrived to collect Sarah, dreading the conversation she would have to have that evening. But when she saw her daughter's face, radiant with pride and accomplishment, her resolve wavered. How could she take this away? "Mama, look," Sarah called out, pointing to the display case where her turnovers sat among the other pastries. "Mrs. Miller put my turnovers with the real ones because they're good enough to sell." Li Wei looked at the pastries her daughter had created and felt a complex mix of pride and heartbreak. They were beautiful, perhaps not perfect, but clearly made with skill and love. And they sat in the same display case where Sarah had pressed her nose for so many weeks, dreaming of impossible things. Mrs. Miller approached with a small white box. "Sarah's turnovers for tonight," she said, but her eyes were studying Li Wei's face with concern. "Could I speak with you for a moment before you leave?" Li Wei's stomach dropped. Had Mrs. Miller somehow sensed that their arrangement was about to end? She followed the older woman to the quiet corner of the bakery where they had first discussed Sarah's apprenticeship. "Li Wei, I can see something is weighing on you," Mrs. Miller said gently. "If there's anything I can do to help, I hope you'll let me know." Li Wei felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack. The kindness in Mrs. Miller's voice, combined with the stress of the day's revelations, overwhelmed her defenses. "I'm going to lose both my jobs," Li Wei said quietly, the words tumbling out despite her intention to handle this privately. "Well, not lose exactly, but the hours are being cut dramatically. I'll need to find evening work again, which means Sarah can't stay here after school anymore." Mrs. Miller listened without interruption, her expression growing more thoughtful with each detail Li Wei shared. When Li Wei finished explaining the situation, Mrs. Miller was quiet for a long moment. "What if," Mrs. Miller said slowly, "what if this wasn't just an apprenticeship anymore? What if Sarah could actually help me with the business in a real way?" Li Wei looked up, confusion replacing despair. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if I hired you both? You to help me with the business side of things, bookkeeping, inventory, customer service, and Sarah to continue learning while actually contributing to the bakery's success. I've been thinking about expanding my offerings, maybe adding some prepared foods for busy families. I could use real help, Li Wei. Adult help. Li Wei stared at Mrs. Miller, afraid to believe what she was hearing. You would hire me, but I don't know anything about running a bakery. You know about working hard, being responsible, and caring about details, Mrs. Miller replied. Those are the most important qualifications. The rest we can teach you, just like we've been teaching Sarah. What do you think? Li Wei looked across the bakery at Sarah, who was carefully wiping down tables with the same attention to detail she brought to everything she did. Her daughter had found something precious here, not just skills, but confidence and purpose. And now Mrs. Miller was offering Li Wei the chance to build a future instead of just surviving day to day. I think, Li Wei said, her voice thick with emotion, that I would like to learn to make beautiful things too. Mrs. Miller's smile was radiant. Then let's talk about new beginnings over some of Sarah's apple turnovers. I have a feeling they taste like hope. That evening, as they walked home together, Sarah chattered excitedly about her perfect turnovers while Li Wei processed the miraculous turn her day had taken. The box of pastries in Sarah's hands contained more than just food. It held the tangible proof that dreams could become reality, that kindness could transform lives, and that sometimes the most beautiful things in life came from the simple act of believing that good things were possible. The apple turnovers were everything Sarah had imagined they would be, and more. But as Li Wei watched her daughter savor each bite, she realized that the real transformation had nothing to do with pastry. It was about a little girl who had looked at beautiful things with such pure appreciation that she had attracted the attention of someone who could teach her to create beauty herself. And it was about a mother who had learned that accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness, but sometimes the first step toward building something wonderful. As they sat at their small kitchen table sharing Sarah's first professional quality creations, Li Wei understood that their morning visits to Miller's bakery had never really been about the pastries at all. They had been about hope, about teaching Sarah to believe in beauty and possibility even when they seemed impossibly out of reach. And somehow, that hope had transformed not just their circumstances, but their understanding of what was possible when people chose to see the best in each other. The little girl who had once pressed her nose against the bakery window, dreaming of impossible sweetness, was now a young baker with flour under her fingernails and confidence in her eyes. And her mother, who had spent years protecting her daughter from disappointment, had learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is stop believing that beautiful things can happen to people like you. Tomorrow they would return to Miller's bakery not as visitors looking through the glass, but as partners in creating the very beauty they had once only dreamed of tasting. And Li Wei knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, with hands that had learned to create good things and hearts that remembered the transformative power of unexpected kindness. That night they shared the cookies with their simple dinner, and Li Wei had to admit they were the most delicious thing she had tasted in months. But more than that, they tasted like hope, like the possibility that their lives could contain sweetness that Sarah had created with her own hands. Mrs. Miller's expression softened. Oh, my dear, you're not trouble at all. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something else entirely.